there we are. So she's in the audience. Where is she? Alice? There we are, Alice. Let's give her a hand. Then we had a number of international keynote speakers who gave talks. This is Professor Sullivan Hug, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Next, John Furlow from Columbia University, the Institute for Research on Climate at Columbia University. Next, Andy Parker spoke this morning on geoengineering, a very interesting new topic that's emerging. Next. And then we had a couple of colleagues from the Global Development Network talking about how research can be supported in developing countries, but particularly the least developed countries. Next. And now we're going to hear from Andrew Norton in a little bit, who is our keynote speaker for this concluding session. Next. This is a variety of activities we had here. There's the Gobeshona core team who presented on Gobeshona at the top left, and then a section of the audience. We had a dinner on the first evening where we also gave an award for young researchers who had published papers in international peer-reviewed journal articles. There's several of them. There were 8 of them altogether. Next. And then we had a series of sessions, plenary and parallel sessions on various topics. There was one on the Barin, one on hills and forests, one on wetlands. We also had a number of our participants from the least developed countries, Universities Consortium on Climate Change, or LUCCC, LUC for short. We had a session for them and with them. And then we had parallel sessions on agriculture, food security, health and migration, mitigation and gender, green growth, which we just had as well. And then one on urban modeling, resilient livelihoods, adaptation technology, disability, and also many parallel sessions on disaster management. I won't go through the full list of them. They're in the program. If you have a copy of the program, you can look at it. We also had sessions, parallel sessions on videos, using videos as research tools, not just as dissemination tools. And then today was our Science Policy Dialogue Day. So we have 3 days of a science conference, and then the 4th and final day is a Science Policy Dialogue Day. And we just had several sessions with policymakers on different topics that we just finished. So in summary, we had a total of 29 sessions, 45 research papers presented, 6 keynotes, and 7 videos presented. In terms of participants, we had a total of 404. That's the largest number we've had so far. There's a distribution of the kinds of participants. Some of them were full participants for the entire period. Some came just for a day or for their sessions. But at any given time, we had a good 70 to 80 people, sometimes 100 people here. So it was quite well attended. In terms of where you can get the information, this is our website, gobeshona.net. We have an archive already of 2,000 plus publications, which are searchable. All the PowerPoints from the conference and all the videos from the conference are going to be uploaded. And indeed, I think they've already been uploaded, so you can download them from there. Next. We have a booklet, which I think we have distributed copies of, which describes our activities over the last 4 years of not just doing research and collecting research and disseminating research, but also making sure that research is actually utilized by policymakers and other users of information and knowledge. We also had social media coverage, both on Facebook and on Twitter. We have well over 10,000 followers on Twitter. So there were many people globally following the event. And then we had in Bangladesh an arrangement with Dhaka Tribune, who have been covering the event. ICCCAD has an arrangement with Dhaka Tribune where we help them produce a monthly supplement on climate change called Climate Tribune, which we have copies of today. It's been produced today on Gobeshona. I hope you all have a copy. And they also covered it during in their newspaper, main newspaper as well. In terms of what are the outputs that we are going to be producing, we have a proceedings which will come out in probably a month or two. The presentations are already up on the website. The photographs will be up on the website. and the videos, I think, are already up on the website. So these are all the outputs in terms of the conference itself. We had, I think, around 30 international participants from different parts of the world, including some of our LUC partners. And then we had a lot of opportunity for networking during the breaks, which is a very important part of our meeting. Next. We've had some, are we going to hear the video?
So much from sessions on local adaptation, national kind of finance and so on. That's what I've enjoyed the most, the chance to meet so many well-informed and interesting people. Recommendations for next time, it's a suggestion that's not novel, it's not my own, but someone suggested specifically bringing in a developing country youth delegation to help build capacity amongst young people who want to work on climate change. I think that would be a fantastic idea. Have a youth day before the main Gobeshona conference, and then include young climate activists and academics in the discussions from then on.
The best thing about this conference is I get to meet so many good researchers, young researchers, professionals, and people from working in this climate change field. And I managed to learn a lot of things about what they are working on. And during this conference, we also managed to discuss about the least developing countries universities consortium for climate change. I got so much opportunity to learn so many new concepts, and at the same time, I also got the opportunity to interact with so many individuals, which I'm looking forward to use these individuals to use as resources for my university and also.
Okay, so that was just a flavor from some of our international participants of their views of what they got out of the conference. So I'm now going to segue into the main session or part of my talk. But before that, let me just explain. One of the, even though we're a short term in existence, is our fourth conference, we have developed certain norms or certain ways of proceeding. The first one is that we don't, or we discourage making recommendations into the ether of something has to be done and somebody else needs to do it. What we do is we make recommendations to ourselves, which in other words means we make a pledge to do something. And we then make that pledge and we make a commitment out of that pledge, and then we follow up on it. And those of you who are here in the beginning at the opening session will have seen me present the pledges that were made last year and what we were able to achieve during the last year, between last year and this year. And now I'm going to present you the commitments that we are going to make for next year, which we will hopefully be able to achieve and report back on at the fifth conference next year. So let me go through the list. There's 5 of them. The first one is something that we had already agreed on before, which was that Gobeshona has been relatively successful in getting together. We now have nearly 50 institutions working on climate change research in Bangladesh, and also many international as well. But we're still very Dhaka centric. So we have made a conscious decision to reach out of Dhaka in a phased manner to different vulnerable zones of the country. And last year we chose to focus on the Barind, the drought-prone area. And as I mentioned in my opening, we made some progress. With Rajshahi University and the Barind Authority over the last year, we've been holding a number of meetings in the region, and we had a special session where they came and presented the work that they did during this conference. For the next year, we are going to focus on the southwest zone, which includes the Sundarbans, and the Howrah Basin, which is in Sylhet, with Shah Jalal University in the latter case and Khulna University in the former case. And then we'll take other places up in phases after that. So our focus for the next year is going to be reaching out to the Sylhet region and reaching out to the Khulna region. Next. The second commitment area is developing a green growth research and action program, which is going to focus primarily on the private sector actors, and within that looking at private sector green funding incentives for the private sector. So green investments, and how do we stimulate them, and how do we stimulate the private sector to use green finance. We will look at both mitigation as well as adaptation. Bangladesh already has quite a lot of work on mitigation in the solar energy sector. Adaptation is just beginning, but we want to promote that. And one of the things we're thinking about doing is maybe developing a prize for the best initiatives amongst the private sector. But maybe next year we can initiate that. This particular initiative, we have had a partnership with the Adam Smith International, based in the UK, they're a private consulting company who works on green growth, and the Policy Research Institute based in Bangladesh. So they'll be helping us lead that, but it's a collective enterprise of Gobeshona. Next. We also had a very good session that was led by Columbia University's Institute for Climate Research, together with CIMMYT, the Center for Maize Research, to propose and get feedback on the idea of developing a climate services academy. And I'm very pleased to say we got very positive feedback, as a result of which we have decided that we will go ahead with it. Exactly what it will be and what it will constitute, we need to plan. But in principle, we've agreed to do it. Columbia University and CIMMYT have agreed to help us devise it. We had the support of the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, the Department of Agriculture Extension, and the Krishi Foundation, Krishi Gobeshona Foundation, has promised to support it as well. And it's an open idea at the moment. We invite everybody to tell us if they're interested in joining. The way we will follow up on each of these is we will have follow-up meetings. We have a monthly meeting of the steering committee. At each monthly meeting of the steering committee, we put these on the agenda for follow-up, and we have 2 or 3 partner institutions who take responsibility for following up, and then they have to do the activities and report back. And they form a subgroup of people who are interested in that particular topic. And we've successfully launched a number of groups, which I won't go into details now, but these are the new groups that we are launching here at Gobeshona 4. Next. And then we have another group looking at communicating research, particularly using visual tools like the video that we had the sessions on this time. We had a parallel session using video that went out very well, but also more broadly using the media, like we use the Dhaka Tribune, for example. Social media, both Twitter and Facebook, increasingly being useful as a means of communication, and also radio, looking at radio, particularly to reach community radio, to reach the masses in Bangladesh. We already have a radio program with Radio Shadin, which is very popular amongst young people who do a regular program on climate change and environmental issues with us. So there'll be a subgroup looking at this. Again, anybody who's interested in these issues should join that group. And it's not just simply dissemination, but how do we use these tools to actually do research as well, and also for disseminating of the research. Next. I think this is the last one. So the last one is the focus on youth leadership program, which we are going to do in Bangladesh with Gobeshona. We're also going to do it in South Asia with the Climate Action Network South Asia, and with the least developed countries with our LUC partners and the least developed country universities. And the idea, again, it's an early phase of an idea. We're going to flesh it out over time, is to focus on innovative solutions from young people. It's no longer training them or teaching them or giving them awareness raising. There's been a lot of that already, but it's now thinking about solutions, encouraging them to come up with innovative solutions. And one of the ideas that we have is to launch a competition amongst young people for innovative solutions to tackle the problem of climate change. We'll have it at the national level in Bangladesh. We'll have similar ones at the national level in the South Asian region, and similar ones at national level in the different LDCs. Each country will pick winners, the first or second winners in each national competition. We will then bring to Bangladesh for Gobeshona 5. So next year, this time, we will have a cohort, we hope, of youth who come through this selection process of innovative practices. And what we are planning to do with the Gobeshona 5 conference is add 2 more days for the youth. So we'll have a youth meeting for all these youth people who get selected on day 0, a day before the Gobeshona conference starts. The youth will then participate during the conference in all the sessions, and we will put a youth representative on every panel in every session. So there's somebody from the youth group to be a panelist. This is a suggestion that Andy made. I think that was well taken. And then we will have another day for them at the end where they will try to come together and come up with their ideas on what they feel they've learned during the conference that they can then take forward collectively as a group. And we will make this into an annual feature of future Gobeshona conferences. So that's an idea that we've come up with, which we will try and implement as we go forward. In fact, I think under the Gobeshona program, we have a youth workshop coming up in March at some time where we will initiate this activity at the Bangladesh level. Next. This is our team, the Gobeshona team. We have a core team of people on the far left on the top. Then we have a volunteers team and a communication social media team and photographers. And also all our colleagues in IUB. I'd like to thank all of them, and I'd like you all to join me in giving them our thanks. I think they've done an excellent job. So thank you very much for the team. And that's it. So join us again, Gobeshona 5, the same dates, 8 to 11 January 2019, in the same place. So you're all invited to come back here a year from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hug, for your concise and comprehensive presentation. Now, I would like to request Dr. A. Atiq Rahman, Executive Director of Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, for his valuable remarks on the conference.
Friends in the podium, friends, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be here. 4 long days, all of us have participated. We have had many old friends, some new ones, and been great pleasure making the human contact that we all needed. Gobeshona is probably one of the words that is entering the parlance of climate change across the world. Because every year, some new people come in, they go away and say this is an innovation happening in Bangladesh where everybody is participating, and it's permeating across various countries, various sectors, and different type of thinking, where it's probably one of the most cost-effective way of communicating the message of climate change, particularly at the level of the research and research communication. So many of the people I've met in other conferences have told me, oh, Gobeshona, yeah, I heard about it, and that's a good way of doing research, so that a young researcher starting don't have to do the hard, laborious work of doing whole literature review. So they know what literature exists, which is, first 6-month job in a PhD for anybody, or early masters, and then it's available. And as a whole, it accumulates. And this cumulative effect is a dynamics in itself, and it is a great pleasure to see how this is growing. As we said, Bangladesh literature so far has been, the climate change literature in Bangladesh has been written largely by non-Bangladeshis. Now it's getting more Bangladeshis. That is not to say that Bangladeshis are not engaged in doing that type of activity. Bangladeshis have been so engaged in activities that research or research output in peer-reviewed journal, which has its own language, own effort, and own system, is something that these researchers or activists could not afford to understand. Bangladesh has already highlighted itself in the negotiation process, and this was highlighted in the beginning of inaugural session. But across the world, it's just not vulnerability that sells. We are hoping to sell solutions more. And in my inaugural talk, I talked about the solar photovoltaic being one of the solutions. Now it's going across the world. This solution was initially supposed to be for the rich, but 4.5 million poor households having solar energy in their houses makes it a technology for the poor. And not only that, every evening, 4 to 6 hours of additional lighting for the families, for the children, makes their education much more feasible, makes them do a lot more work, saves their health from the ingress of fumes of burnt kerosene to light that is pretty health-wise pretty sound. In this conference, we have had some very new ideas and thinking. One is geoengineering, bioengineering, solar radiation management. This is something new, and the novelty may become a necessity, and the whole question of governance and ethics of this becomes very, very important. We started about 10 years ago through the Royal Society, calling a group of scientists, and I was one of the steering committee members, 3 committee members started it, and now it's taking shape. There's already a large project on SMRGI, which is the Solar Radiation Management Initiative, which Andy Parker is leading, and basically Andy has built his career or started with this and stuck to it. So for the young people, one of the lessons we are learning on research is doing the research, being at it, and maintaining continuity. If we do not build on the research, then it doesn't follow up that much, and the next person doesn't work that well. In the Western world, research really means that a professor builds around him or her a group of scientists who then take the message, make variation, but one theme emerges. And this theme becomes the expertise of that university or that department. That is the way we have to learn to move forward. Sadly, that group formation of researchers hasn't happened that much in our country, and that's something we have to do. Climate change per force becomes a stimulus because it's not going to go away. Bangladesh is not going to get out of the climate change problem in the next 20 years, 30 years. We are going to be richer. We are going to probably eat better food, purer water. Doesn't mean our climate change impacts are going to go away. So there will be a lot of people required to address that problem. Many of you may be aware, particularly for my international friends, that the government of Bangladesh has already declared the the Ministry of Environment and Forest being called Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Though some of us have been working hard at trying to build a Ministry of Climate Change, that will take still some years to come, but will happen at the end. The final word that I want to say about climate change and its follow-up is on innovation and enterprise. We have to make essentially a product, a good output out of this impact that we are having, which is often debilitating for our economy, for agriculture, for our fishery, forestry, and health, and the population at large. So we have to convert that challenge into an opportunity and move on. And that's something is what we are looking forward to. And we need for that a large working force and intellectually engaged people. And this is what hopefully the process of Gobeshona will lead us to. So it is a combined effort of many. It is everybody is welcome to it. And it is an open system that makes it interesting and allows people to say more. In one of the discussions, I had said, many people are saying we have forgotten this, we have not taken riverbank erosion into account, we have not said enough about salinity. And my response to that was that do not ask Gobeshona to do it for you. You do it for Gobeshona. That's what we are all together. And that's how we are going to move forward to Gobeshona Conference 5, 6, and onward. So welcome you to the future and learning from the past. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Atik, for your inspirational and motivational speech. Now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Indu Norton. His keynote speech topic is Social Science Research and the Climate Action Challenge. I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Norton. Dr. Indu Norton is the director of IIT. He is an applied anthropologist who works to promote social and environmental justice. His career spans both research and operational roles in academic and development contexts. He has worked extensively on the social dimensions of climate change, poverty, gender and social analysis, social policy and human rights in development practice. Dr. Norton has experience of working in Africa, Asia and Latin America. Dr. Norton has expertise in climate change, natural resource governance, social policy, social inclusion, human rights, poverty, gender, social analysis, and urban social change. Dr. Norton is currently working as the director of IIT, where he oversees the full range of IIT's policy and action research activities, particularly focused on the policies and social dimensions of climate change and climate action. Before IIT, Dr. Norton worked as the Director of Research for the Overseas Development Institute, lead social scientist in the World Bank, head of social development for the UK Department for International Development, DFID, and doctoral fieldwork in Mali. Dr. Norton is fluent in English, French, and Bambara. Now I'd like to request Dr. Norton to give his keynote speech. Dr. Norton, please.
Thank you very much. Glad to see you bending that particular curve upwards in this case, but thank you. Thanks a lot. And many thanks. It's tremendous to be here. This is the second time that I've been to Bangladesh since I became director of IID. And I'm always amazed at the quality of work here and the quality also of engagement of researchers with the policy process, which I think is exemplary and indeed much stronger than in many other countries I could think of, including many developed countries. So it's amazing to be here, and I'm really honoured to be giving the closing keynote at the 4th Gobeshona Conference. Many thanks to all of the partners, and a quick and particular word of thanks, I guess, to our special partners around this special project of building this extraordinary institution, the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Dhaka, Dr. Sullivan Hug, the director, and also from Bangladesh Centre for Advanced Studies, Dr. Atik Rahman, and also Professor Omar Rahman from the International University of Bangladesh. Thanks also for that generous introduction. I'll be speaking from my own perspective, and as the introduction said, I'm basically a social scientist in terms of background, an applied anthropologist. And I started serious work on climate change, preparing an edited volume with a colleague, Robin Mearns, on the social dimensions of climate change in 2010. That book dealt with social impacts writ large. It looked at gender, it looked at impacts on different livelihood groups and different generations. And it also looked at what we call complex human responses at that point, which was looking at behavioural responses that might not be direct, might have many other factors involved, migration, fragility and conflict. I think it's fair to say, looking back now, that in 2010 it's striking how much we underplay both the speed of warming as it will be experienced over subsequent years, but also the potential consequences in all of those fields. It's interesting to revisit at this point at the end of 2017 and beginning of 2018. I will speak to the context at this moment, also to social science research responses, just a few words to suggest that, and also some notes on how we can make research count and how we can have the best possible impact from that. 2017 obviously has been a challenging year. We haven't heard the T word said much, but it's the first year we've had to come to terms with a major power, a very major power, with a climate denier in charge of the executive, President Trump. There's also been the worry that this represents a kind of continuing rise of reactionary nationalism, which could challenge the very structures, the multilateral governance structures that we need to do anything relevant in this space. Having said that, COP23 could indeed have been a lot worse, and there were a lot of positives that emerged, particularly from the leadership of Fiji, but also from this extraordinary mobilization at the subnational level. We saw that particularly perhaps in reaction to the political changes in the States from the US, from cities, from civil society, from business, and from other communities. Many of you will have seen this morning the announcement from Bill de Blasio from New York City, both of a target to divest the huge pension fund, 189 billion, completely from fossil fuels in 5 years, but also to commence climate litigation in relation to 6 fossil fuel majors. Can that change in, if you like, the dynamics and the structure of US political engagement on climate change? Can that possibly catalyse a similar mobilisation at different levels in other parts of the world? One of the themes emerging, obviously, is a need for increased ambition. The Talanoa Dialogue is supposed to deliver increased ambition on mitigation. And it's never been, I think, the case that's never been more urgent and more necessary. From the epidemic of extreme weather events throughout 2017, through to all manner of recent research, whether it's on ocean ecosystems and the alarming signals there, or on recent work suggesting that even at 2 degrees, we will see 25%, a quarter of the Earth's surface, experiencing significant loss of rainfall, significant aridification. So the signals also from the global temperature rise are telling us that 2 degrees is anything but safe. I'm sure you all have your own list of things around that. And that the 1.5 degree target, the more ambitious target from Paris, is more necessary than ever. I think there's one figure which Celine was quoting today, that the difference between 1.5 and 2 might be 100 million people, more people displaced by climate change, just in that half degree difference. But even in relation to 2 degrees, we're falling way short, and the current trajectory is based on the national action plans on which Paris is based, have us at 3 degrees at the end of the century, and business as usual, probably more like 4. So I would expect to see a much more polarised and urgent debate over 2018 around these issues, a rise of social activism in many parts of the world, and a rise in climate litigation. Again, the New York City example is possibly presages things that we're going to see throughout the world over the course of 2018. We don't know how much climate litigation will deliver in the end. It's delivered some big successes like in Holland, but globally we don't yet know where we're going to arrive with that. But we do know that sort of developments in attribution science are creating an ever stronger case for a legal argument to be made in relation to fossil fuel companies and their responsibilities for climate change. You'd expect to see also the debate on climate geoengineering, whether it's carbon dioxide removal. It's been the focus of much attention over 2017, with the increasingly uncomfortable realisation that most of the scenarios or pathways that lead us to 2 degrees, and basically all of the IPCC scenarios that lead us to 1.5 degrees, depend on technologies not yet really operationalized and deployed. Or will we see, I think it's likely we'll see also the debate on solar radiation management, which we had a great presentation from Andy Parker today that Atik has also mentioned. We'll see that also becoming more intense, and it's going to be certainly contentious. And then there are technological advances, obviously, which can be benign, but also improvements in efficiency, renewables getting ever cheaper, battery storage can obviously deliver game-changing results in relation to power generation. But we may also see technological developments that are malign from our perspective. I don't know how many of you have seen emerging estimates of the energy demands of Bitcoin. One such estimate puts Bitcoin at using as much energy this year as Denmark. Obviously, cryptocurrencies are growing. I believe not all of them are as thirsty for power as Bitcoin is, but this could easily eat up a vast amount of the gains that we make in energy efficiency. So not everything on the technology front is going to be rosy for whatever the huge successes we're seeing in relation to renewables and other benign technologies. Now let me move on. I said I'd offer some thoughts on priorities for social science research. I'm sure many of you would have your own list. So I'll just suggest 4 critical areas, not intended to be exclusive, where social science research is going to be really important over the coming decade, and also where the contribution, obviously, of Southern researchers is critical and essential. The first one is improving our record at getting a decent amount of international climate finance to the sharp end where people suffer the effects. In IIED, we've called that getting money where it matters. That's largely an action research agenda. Currently, we estimate that of the big international climate funds, only, less than 10% of their program pipeline is intended to reach the local level. Obviously, the amounts that actually get to local institutions, whether you're talking about private sector, community or local government, is going to be less than that. But there's a need for action there, and there's a need to demonstrate ways in which we can make that happen realistically. And that's really important also for the sustainability of support for international climate finance throughout the world. The second area, returning to the agenda that I started my personal journey on tentatively in 2010, is about documenting the social and human impacts. And again, many of the most compelling case studies, but also much of the most compelling research on this is done in Bangladesh. The displacement and migration issues are obviously on a phenomenal scale here, on a scale in terms of numbers of people that's hard to match anywhere else in the world. But you have also, I think, a spectrum there with these kind of issues like migration and fragility, from relatively simple processes where you have a biophysical driver like rising sea levels, that's pretty hard to ignore, through to issues that are much more complex and behavioural. How globally are people seeing the incentives to invest in their land and natural resource base? Are the uncertainties of a changing climate going to impact on how confident people feel to put either time or money into that resource base? So there's a huge spectrum there from, if you like, the fairly direct to the more speculative, but research, I think, is needed across the full range of that spectrum. And also, obviously, we need policy solutions. There's excellent work by Celine, which I'm happy to quote, looking at possible policy solutions in relation to building a network of secondary towns which are climate resilient, and also where, if you like, migration or displacement can be directed towards those locations rather than all rocking up in capital cities that, you know, the megacities suffer huge constraints, I think, in most parts of the world. So I think that's a brilliant idea which could easily be extended to other environments usefully. And we need also to make the case for global climate action on a global scale, which means not just understanding the social impacts, but communicating them in a compelling way. And again, the work of this conference is exemplary in that sense. The third area to highlight is the need to work on understanding the distributional impacts, not just of climate change, but of associated emergent technological solutions and actions. The discussion on solar radiation management we had here obviously touches on this, because the first thing people think of when they look at a technology like that is that it might have different impacts in different geographies. We're at a very early stage in understanding even the physical science of that, but there's an urgent need, obviously, to match that with social research and governance and political science research that I think practitioners are very aware of. But it's not just that. Carbon dioxide removal, the primary technology that's being discussed in terms of any kind of sense of it being close to practical implementation, is BECCS, bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage. And again, some of the projections on that in terms of the volume of land use are very, very worrying in terms of the implications that would have on nutrition, but also the security of tenure of natural resources in many parts of the world, caveated by the fact that there are a lot of questions about how feasible it is, which is, again, another question over the way in which we are placing bets around climate change at the moment and what it will be possible to do in the future to deal with emissions and to deal with concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. But it does seem to me around this that there's a single great conundrum, which is that if we had the kind of sense of collective action and global purpose, and indeed the structure for global governance that we would need to do that stuff safely, things like solar radiation management, then we wouldn't need it in the first place. We would have dealt with emissions much better than we have. So there are all kinds of questions there, questions of political economy. The need for Southern voice is critical. And in that sense, I would like to give a shout out and really a strong commendation for the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative and the way in which they're placing Southern research at the centre of their agenda and offering, if you like, finance to take that forward. I think that's exemplary. Many other things we could talk about. If we're going to have effective green transitions, we're going to need to deal with avoiding social harms with making those just transitions. Many parts of the world have huge numbers of people still involved in the coal industry, over 1 million in India, much, much fewer in developed countries for all kinds of obvious reasons. But I think one thing we've learned from the politics of the last year is that those kinds of social harms that arise from rapid economic transitions can also cause political disruption, which can derail the green transition. So that's a key area. And there are many other areas like ICTs and adaptation and the use of mobile technology where Bangladesh is a leader. And there are many other areas where we can look both positive and negative at those kinds of, if you like, technological transitions and their social impacts in terms of gender, in terms of livelihood groups, in terms of generations, youth, and so on. The fourth area is the challenge of inclusive and sustainable urban development. The trajectory of urbanisation in many parts of the South, particularly a lot of least developed countries, is going to be extraordinary. One estimate in relation to Nigeria is that it will add 412 million urban inhabitants by 2050. So these are extraordinary and transformational shifts. And the challenge, of course, is how we can shape that development to be inclusive and to be sustainable, to be green, because it's much easier to do that in advance than to fix problems certainly in terms of urban configurations and urban governance after you already have a problematic situation, a mess. My final words are about the theme of making this research and this engagement count, and I think there's much to be learned from this conference. A lot of this will need to be driven from the South, particularly in terms of research that motivates climate action. And as I was saying in the introduction, I think one of the striking things hearing at this conference, but also reading about Bangladesh, is that the experience of matching research with policy implementation here, particularly in the field of adaptation, is a real, really, really strong, and in many ways shows global leadership for Bangladesh in that area. So we need networks to share that experience, south-south and between, and south-north, as well as north-south. There's much to be learned. And one of the key things that we always need to be thinking about is the how we can make the research count in terms of policy and outcomes on the ground. And one small example of that we're very proud of in IIED is the work that we have done also with BCAS Bangladesh Centre for Advanced Studies and the International University of Bangladesh in developing this experiment about generating a really world-class climate research institute in the south, namely the International Centre for Climate Change and Development here in Dhaka. We look forward to continuing to work in that way, to build the capacity and relationships that will be needed to drive transformational change on a global scale. And such an effort has never been more urgent and more important than it is now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Norton, for your motivational speech on climate change and social science research. I would now like to invite the Honorable Chief Guest, Mr. Sudipta Mukherjee, Country Director, United Nations Development Programme, UNDP Bangladesh, to say a few words.
Good afternoon, everybody, and Assalamu alaikum. I normally would have started with saying ladies and gentlemen, but these are all gentlemen here. So for Gobeshona 5, let's see, it become very different. I can see Farah Kabi somewhere sitting there. So Gobeshona 5, concluding session, you're here. Absolutely. Anyway, let me start by a couple of congratulations. The first congratulations is, of course, a very successful conference, all of you. Doesn't surprise me at all coming from Dr. Sullivan Hug. But the other congratulations is, this morning I actually received a breaking news on SMS that President Trump has said that he might actually go back to the Paris deal. Whether it happens or not, but at least it's a good start. And I think Dr. Hug had wind of it because when I first came here, I saw that one of the main sponsors was USAID from the American people. So it has already started. Anyway, on a different note, when I was coming here this afternoon, I actually was sort of confronted with my extra active conscience that did I quite belong here? Among such eminence, I don't quite belong here because I have no specialization in climate change. But then I have been invited, and I have been invited as UNDP, so I am representing UNDP here. The second bit was I well prepared enough to actually deliver something sensibly? On that, normally whenever you're not well prepared in Dhaka city, you can blame it on traffic. But here, I could actually blame it on climate change. Every day I'm finding it so difficult to wake up in the morning. It's so cold. In fact, this is another sign of climate change, and it's for real. Now, let me get back to something more serious. I think after coming here, I see that, and as is to be expected, that Dr. Sullivan Hug has got the best recipe to get something really going well. I heard a few words here. He's built up an incredible network. You mentioned about 50 different institutions across Bangladesh and elsewhere. He's got 50 sponsors here, if not more. He's got young people. If I go by what I'm seeing here, and if 50% of this room are young people and 50% of the 400 participants over the last 4 days, it's 200 people. 200 young minds who are going to innovate and who are going to join a competition every year. They've been doing it and receiving awards. And although I'm not quite well prepared for it, I didn't come prepared for it, but I did hear Dr. Haq mention another new competition next year, starting, or is it starting 2018? It is starting 2018. I can assure him, not a big amount, but UNDP will be a sponsor. Okay? Now, apart from the more visible, in fact, one of the good things about being invited to any such forum is that when you start preparing for actually delivering something, you do research. And today, research is much easier because all you have to do is to have good internet and connection to Google. So I learned a lot of new things in terms of data. For example, other than the more obvious things, and we heard some mentions even when we heard particularly Andrew Norton speak, that apart from more visible, obvious impacts such as increasing frequency and intensity of floods, tropical cyclones, droughts, and changing weather patterns, there are many other things which are actually collateral results, impacts of climate change. One is displacement, and the figures are staggering. Since 2009, an estimated 1% every second has been displaced by a disaster, with an average of almost 23 million people. And I recall that there was an article that Dr. Haq had actually shared. And I remember reading there that a large proportion of people wanting to migrate from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe are actually climate displaced. So, doesn't come as a surprise. The second one is food insecurity. Again, doesn't come as a surprise that obviously, if nothing else, just looking at 2017 alone, the northern floods did create a huge amount of food insecurity in the country, with huge amounts of rice having to be imported. Public health, again, something that this is my third near sort of climate change challenged country posting. I was in Iraq, where we were facing increasing desertification. I was in Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone is also being badly affected. Every year it suffers tremendous floods, flash floods in which lots of lives are lost. And then, of course, Bangladesh. And I think, if you really look at even not just public health in terms of malaria on the rise, diarrhea, cholera, etc. on the rise, but I could also see that the 2017 increase in dengue in Kolkata and the chikungunya in Dhaka are also perhaps large part attributable to climate change. UNDP's interest goes beyond just climate change, because as with the Millennium Development Goals, we know that for the Sustainable Development Goals, there are huge amounts of interdependencies. And in particular, as an agency which is actually mandated to look at helping nations across the world reduce poverty, the whole nexus between climate change and poverty is something that really bothers us. And in more recent times, and I have a couple of gentlemen on the table, they know that UNDP has been trying to get a particular climate change related project from Green Climate Fund for Bangladesh. And one of the biggest challenges that we've faced with that, we have not been able to clearly explain the nexus between poverty and climate change. Hopefully, later this year, we'll see some positive movement. Now, UNDP obviously is doing some work across the world on climate change, and in Bangladesh is not an exception. We have inclusive budgeting and financing for climate change work, which is with the Finance Ministry. And this is interesting because it is actually building capacity within the Finance Ministry to actually make budgets which are far more climate responsive. And I think 2017 was a special year, milestone year, because there was a special climate budget that was presented there. And I think more importantly, this whole body of work, I think if we can carry on with seriousness in the ministries themselves, it will actually mean a transformative shift in Bangladesh with greater resilience developing for disasters and climate change impacts. And then, as in many cases, serve as good practice, not just South-South, but South-North, and Bangladesh exporting this experience. We have an urban program, and I did hear about urban programs. We have an urban program which is yet to get operationalized on the ground, but it is about making poor settlements in urban areas much more climate resilient. And amongst other things, there will be huge amounts of investments made in terms of awareness and sensitization of both slum communities and city planners and city managers in terms of climate change. We have a local government initiative on climate change, again looking at building local government capacity and also particularly focusing on women. We have the project that I mentioned on Green Climate Fund. If that comes through, this would be something which again is women focused. And then we're working on a number of areas related to energy, renewable energy. And then of course, we're trying to mainstream climate change. In fact, one of the things that we've done, typically when you look at any work within the UN system, there are a couple of areas which are normally the standard cross-cutting areas. You talk about gender, you talk about youth. But we have started doing, in 2017, we mainstreamed the idea of actually looking at every possibility or potential for curbing corruption. And this year we're looking at opportunities for, in some ways, to contribute to climate change. So now, basically, just to conclude, I think, what I am taking back from this particular conference, this is my first time here. First of all, I told you that wonderful recipe that Salim has very nicely put together. The idea of getting youth there, getting ideas, innovation there, commitment there. And I saw his use of social media. So he's throughout sitting next to me. I was quite getting distracted because he was always doing some tweeting. So if you could do all that together, and on top of that, there's one additional thing that I heard today, that Gobeshona does not give recommendations. In fact, that's wonderful because that's music to my ears. Because every conference that I've gone to, they always give recommendations, 90% of which I never follow through. I think it's much better to start. Charity should begin at home. You start with pledges, and I think this is an outstanding takeaway from me. I think this is something I can assure you that UNDP Bangladesh will do from now on. We will not make recommendations, we will make pledges. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee, for your valuable time and valuable speech. Now, I'd like to request the chair of the session, Professor Abul Rahman, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Independent University of Bangladesh, for his concluding remarks. Sir.
Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists who are all male, as was pointed out. Fortunately, the audience is more mixed, which is, I think, really a positive sign. And dear students, it's really a privilege for me to be here to talk at the concluding session. And one of the more interesting activities that I do as a Vice Chancellor is that I'm asked to talk at a variety of opportunities, some of which I know relatively little about. This is kind of an in-between situation. Professionally, I'm a demographer and a psychiatrist, so there are aspects of overlap with climate change, but then there are also lots of issues in climate change which I know relatively little about. But that has never constrained me to talk about it, just like President Trump. The lack of information is never a bar, and I think that's a very inspiring message to all our students, that you should not be afraid to speak up because you don't know what you're talking about. So there are some positive things about what has happened in 2017 in the US. But starting off from that, it's interesting as I reflect on it, climate change has become kind of a leitmotif for both people who invoke it to explain everything that goes on in the world, and the importance of it. So it's often viewed as an existential issue, that if we don't deal with it, basically our existence as the human race is at risk. And interesting enough, even for its detractors, um, it is seen as the big bugbear, the big sort of the 400-pound gorilla in the room. And I think it's important for us to put things in some perspective. Not everything is about climate change, but it's an interesting way to think about a lot of things. And I think that's very important because I think the more one tries to put everything into the climate change bag, uh, it really enrages people who will pick up on small issues and say that, look, this has obviously got not anything to do with climate change, and you guys are always trying to invoke that anything bad that is happening because of climate change, and obviously this is something that's not. And I think we're getting ourselves caught up uh, in this kind of we're getting lost in the trees and losing sight of the forest. Obviously, climate change is important. It may even be crucial, but we need to be careful about what we attribute to it and what we don't. And there, I think I want to bring this back to the notion of Gobeshona, which is research. At the heart of research, and having spent most of my life in academia, at the heart of research is what I call is setting boundaries. Is trying to understand what we know, how we know it, how well we know it, and then the other side of the coin is what we don't know, and is to be able to be comfortable with uncertainty and a range of what I call predictive probabilities. One of the most difficult things to communicate is uncertainty. People like black and white kind of scenarios, particularly journalists. They want to tell you that either this big storm that's happening in the US right now, the winter storm, is all because of climate change or it's not. Obviously the answer is much more mixed. But I think this goes to a much larger question of how we view research and its impact on policy. Policymakers like black and white answers. They like prescriptive answers. They do like recommendations. They don't like pledges, they like recommendations. Pledges involve money, which fortunately, unfortunately, researchers have no control over. Recommendations don't require money, and recommendations can always change. But I think this is part of what I would call the big sort of cognitive dissonance between research and policy, is that research is built on the appreciation and of humility and uncertainty. Policy is not about being humble, it's about knowing what you're going to do, and you're not given any prizes for saying, well, this may work. When you sell a policy, when you pitch a policy to your constituents, you have to promise things, and if you don't promise, if you say, well, your income may go up or your life may improve if you do this, it's unlikely that you'll get voted into office the next time around. So I think there is a bit of a cognitive structural dissonance between research and policy, which needs to be, I think, better addressed by researchers and by policymakers. And I think one of the best things that Gobeshona is doing is trying to train a new generation of people on how to bridge this divide, on how to understand what the message is and what the limits of the message is and what is the evidence base for it. Because, one of the things, skepticism arises from sort of perceived discrepancies in the evidence base, right? And I'm being very, very precise here. But basically, it says that, basically, how do you know what you're saying is going to be true? Is it really possible that 20% of Bangladesh will go underwater in 50 years, or whatever your number that you like? And it's interesting to me that when in the lay press, when this debate is talked about, this particular issue is interesting because it affects people here. You either get people saying, no, it's absolutely going to happen, or you're going to say that's never going to happen. You don't have this range of possibilities that, some of this is going to happen. And even if it's 10% and 5%, it's still something we should worry about. One gets wedded to these particular predictions, and then the whole debate is, detractors like Trump and others say, well, there's absolutely no hard evidence it's going to be 20 years, but it might be 50 years, which at some level doesn't make a difference. The question is, this is an impending disaster and how are we going to deal with it? So my first sort of recommendation, unfortunately, I don't have money to give, so I can't make pledges, but I can make recommendations to Gobeshona 5, is that I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed much more deliberately, is how do we communicate uncertainty to policymakers without losing credibility. Because I think the fear is if you say that, okay, this may happen, and there are many, many factors why this could happen, policymakers get frustrated and say, look, either tell me it's going to happen or not. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done on both sides of the picture. I think researchers need to understand the imperatives of policymakers, and policymakers need to understand that they don't always get clear-cut answers of the type or simplistic answers of the type that they're looking for, and they need to modify the message. And I think it's important for us to understand that audiences are able to deal with ambiguity. I don't think people want to be told that this will either happen or not happen. It's fine to say there's a good chance that it will happen, and we need to worry about that. So that's the first thing that I'd like Gobeshona 5 to think about. The other aspect that I want to talk about goes back to the part of the role of universities. And we are very, very proud to sponsor the Gobeshona platform, and also ICCCAD as a whole is a child of the university environment. And the reason why universities are involved because they are in the business of building capacity, of building the next generation of training, of teaching, of creating the next generation of leaders who will be able to think smart, who will be able to think about complex issues, and who will be able to integrate both behavioral and infrastructural technocratic problems and to think about it in a more nuanced way. IUB was built on the philosophy that a liberal arts education is key to, well-rounded education. And here again, I want to sort of relate that. I think it's much more important to raise climate change literacy across a range of students than just to produce the next generation of climate change researchers. And the reason I say that is you're not going to be able to implement policy unless you can get a buy-in from people. So yes, there are huge gaps in climate change, in the various multidisciplinary approaches to climate change research and to come up with sort of complex solutions to complex problems. But also I think it's important for the larger constituency that the people who are not going to do climate change research per se to understand what's at stake here. And I think a lot of the skepticism that we see comes from this sense that we don't really know what's going on, and we don't want to believe a group of pointy-headed intellectuals telling us what's going to happen. I don't think there is a buy-in, and I think there is a great need to spread the message to a wider audience. So I think that's important. That while I think it's crucially important that we teach young people to do research and to know the limits of research, I think it's also important that we spread the message to a wider audience. And I'll tell you something that, just in the last 1 month, my thinking about climate change, and I think of myself a fairly sophisticated consumer of data and information, was massively turned around by, I'm just going to mention 3 things. One is this notion of carbon capture. There was a wonderful article in The Economist, which I think the whole article was about 4 or 5 pages, but it really brought home to me how all of the different scenarios, whatever scenario, whether you use 2 degrees or 4 degrees, even in the most optimistic scenario, you are going to have to invest hugely in new technologies for carbon capture, which we really don't even know whether, we don't even have pilot schemes for those. I mean, you're not going to be able to, I think as Andrew pointed out, one of the things is to increase forestation, but obviously you can't, the whole world cannot be a forest, and obviously that doesn't make sense. So you're going to have to come up with, much more complicated strategies of how to capture carbon. And I never realized how carbon capture was at the heart of any kind of response. And I think this kind of, and I would say that article has done more to change my thinking about the complexities of adaptation to climate change and mitigation than anything else that I've read. And it was written it came out in The Economist, which is it's a magazine read by lay people, not by scientists per se, but it made a huge difference. Now, the second thing, similarly, was a very interesting article in the New York Times about artificial intelligence and deep neural networks and how we predict things. because a lot of the debate about climate change is about the precision of the prediction, right? And one of the very interesting things to me is that a lot of this technology and this approach uses massive amounts of data to come up with testable propositions. And it's fascinating what they're being able to do, that we are now able to predict things into a much greater degree of precision than we were able to before. We may not quite understand how we model it, but machine learning is a kind of a very weird beast, and it's something that it's coming into in everything. I mean, it's ironic that it came about to try to uh, come up with self-driven cars, but the basic conceptual ideas of deep neural networks are much more, I think, spread way beyond just coming up with autonomously driven vehicles. But the point here is that even if you were able to come up with, and this is my last point that I want to bring, let's say we got much better predictions. I would argue, so what? The real problem is, why are we having such a great difficulty in getting people to accept it? And I think the focus, and that's where I think the social science research is so crucial. Why is it so difficult for people to do things which are supposedly good for them? And we know that we all do things which are not good for us. We drive too fast, we drink too much, we take too many drugs, whatever it is that we don't exercise enough, and that's not because of a lack of knowledge. I mean, I'll tell you, as a public health research, everybody knows what to do, so it's not a lack of knowledge about what to do. And I think too much of the debate about climate change has been about trying to create the evidence base about getting better predictions of saying, okay, this is what's going to happen, and having a doomsday scenario. I think the much more important work that needs to be done, and this is where I would like Gobeshona 5 to focus on, is this whole area, of behavioral economics, of sort of psychological research, which looks at why people have such a hard time changing behavior. Because at some level, whatever we come up with, we are asking people to change behavior on a massive scale. All right? I mean, no matter what you do. And why is it so difficult to do that? We need to understand much more about it. We need to understand that you can build all the infrastructure you need. If people don't use it, then it's not going to work. And I'm reminded of it once again, a very interesting article in The Economist called Shock Therapy. And it talks about the fact that most developing countries are spending huge amounts of resources in investing in building better infrastructure to provide electricity. And I was reminded about your comment about Nigeria. Nigeria has excess capacity in terms of electricity grids, but no one is using it. And that's what I think too much of the emphasis has been on this technocratic approach to say, look, there's a gap here. We need to invest all these resources in building better infrastructure, whether it's electricity grids or water grids. And I'll end with something that's related to climate change. I was talking to a young person who I'm sort of semi-advising on an issue about water supply in Khulna city. And it's a very interesting issue because it brings together lots of different things which have to do with climate change. Apparently, Khulna city has a lot of tube wells. They're randomly distributed. Most of them are have been privately placed, and they are basically they're extracting so much water that the water table is declining very rapidly, and that's a great concern to everyone. So the solution that has been promoted by the Asian Development Bank with funding from Asian Development Bank and by governments is to provide piped water, because piped water would be brought in from somewhere else, and this would hopefully uh, convince people to switch to piped water from tube wells, and that this would be one way of addressing this issue of too much water being extracted. The interesting thing is that there's a whole body of research suggesting that this is unlikely to work, and it's all behavioral work. So they're seeing this problem is that Khulna doesn't have a well-developed water infrastructure, unlike other cities. So you need to throw money at Khulna city and to give them these have this mega project to provide piped water. Right? This is a very typical bilateral supported thing that the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, all of these institutions love to support. Big projects which will help people's welfare. interestingly enough, the person I was talking to, her whole dissertation research at Cornell is based on the idea that there are huge advantages to local control, that people like having their own little tube well, which they can control, and they have no faith in government. So anything that's provided by a centralized authority is unlikely to work. As someone said, if you live in Bangladesh, you're very well aware of it, that you turn the tap and no water comes out. So because you don't control it, the water authority, supplies water sporadically. There are technical reasons for it. There are also political reasons, and access and privilege and all of these things come in. So I want to end by saying that research is complicated because the world is complicated, and I think we shouldn't dumb it down. I think it's important for us to recognize that there are complex problems with complex solutions, and we need to train the next generation of researchers, which is exactly what Gobeshona is doing. My recommendation is just make sure that they are able to communicate the range of uncertainties that exist, because I think we'll get better policy if that is better explained. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your concluding remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very much at the end of the session. Now I would like to invite our honorable guest, Mr. Rashid Chaudhary, Chairman Board of Trustees, Independent University, Bangladesh. Mr. Chaudhary is personally a great supporter of ICCCAD and a good mentor also. Sir, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon. We are actually towards the end of the concluding session of this very important fourth Gobeshona Annual Conference, which has been spread over 4 days. I'm the last speaker, but I'm not a speaker, not to give a lecture on climate change. I'm here to give a vote of thanks. Thank God for that, because I'm not an expert on climate change. Though I believe in the importance of climate change. It is very important. And we have had this, before I go for the vote of thanks, just a few words, which I would like to say, is IUB is absolutely delighted and privileged to have had this opportunity to support conferences related to climate change, which may have adverse impacts in vulnerable countries like ours, Bangladesh. And we have been involved right from the first Gobeshona till now. Gobeshona 5 will be there, and it carries on, because we sincerely believe in its importance. It's vitally important for our country and for many other countries. Whether Trump believes it or not, whether he thinks it's a hoax or not, we in Bangladesh believe it is a serious problem. And I also feel proud that IUB is associated with ICCCAD. ICCCAD has been absolutely fantastic. We have been working together, as you know, for the last few years, and Dr. Sullivan Hug, under his dynamic leadership, and his very competent team, we have noticed, we have observed that they have made a lot of inroads, a lot of practical steps taken forward in the last few years. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, there was almost next to nil awareness about climate change. And now when I speak to some of my friends, they are familiar with it. But we still have a lot of hurdles. We still need to go forward. But I'm sure that the way we are going forward, it is possible. It's a matter of time. When, as they say, don't give up, never give up. Go on and we shall achieve our objectives. It's very important. That was one, and also we have a School of Environmental Science and Management, and along with ICCCAD, we do a master's course, right, on this course on climate change. And I believe it is a fairly popular course on that. And with ICCCAD's name and with IUB, we are making inroads and people are getting familiar with that. With these words, I would like straight to the point because this is the end. The 4 days, you look tired, you don't want to listen to any more talk. Is enough. So I'll just come straight to the point now. A word of thanks to all the distinguished guests, starting with Dr. Sullivan Hug, Director, International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICCCAD, Dr. Atiq Rahman, Executive Director, Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. I know Dr. Atiq also, and he knows me also. We come from Cadet College. He's from Fordhar Cadet College. I'm from Chinanda Cadet College. We have the same background, but profession is different. I'm a businessman. You are a very educated intellectual. Yeah. Dr. Andrew, okay. Dr. Andrew Norton, the keynote speaker, Director, International Institute for Environment and Development. And of course, our chief guest for today, Mr. Shidipto Mukherjee, Country Director, United Nations UNDP, which has been here for many years in Bangladesh. And of course, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Umar Rahman, the chairman of the concluding session, and our very successful Vice Chancellor, who's pretty well known in this industry. Special thanks to all our participants, the speakers, both from home and abroad, the Gobeshona Steering Committee members, the IUB faculty and management staff. They're the ones who work from behind. They are known heroes, and they're the ones that will make it happen. And it's very important that we recognize their contribution. The media, the volunteers, the support staff, and of course, our main sponsor, USAID, Bangladesh, who has been sponsoring Gobeshona Young Researchers Program since 2014. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring words. We are very pleased to have you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Gobeshona, we would like to extend our thanks to distinguished guests for their valuable time. Thanks to the audience, participants, media, and guests. We especially thank the Board of Trustees, faculty and management of IUB for their kind and extended continuous support. We are grateful to the Gobeshona core team, volunteers, rapporteurs, photographers, and the steering committee members for their contribution and hard work for the conference. Last but not the least, we would like to thank USAID Bangladesh for their support and guidance to make Gobeshona a success. Hope you had a great time. We would now, I would like all of you for the refreshment at the food court. Our volunteers would be waiting outside to give you directions. We look forward to your continuous support of the upcoming ICCCAD and Gobeshona events. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to request the panelists for a group photo at the stage.